You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, the eyes of the nation are on Judge Boasberg's courtroom right now. Judge Boasberg demanded that Donald Trump's administration not continue to deport these Venezuelans who are accused gang members until they've actually had their due process. The Trump administration refused to comply with this court order. And so, in turn, Judge Boasberg demanded that the Trump administration come back into court to explain themselves. We now have an update as far as how that hearing went. Can you explain what happened?
You know, it's pretty clear, Brian, based on the reporting, that Chief Judge Jeb Boasberg, the Chief Judge of Federal District Court in Washington, D.C., when he was grilling Donald Trump's DOJ lawyers about why it appears that they may have violated his court order to turn planes around, the reporting is Boasberg was incredulous. I'm going to use a word from my Jersey days. It seems like Judge Boasberg was pissed, and he has demanded more information. Here is the form that more information will take. The first thing he said when the DOJ attorneys were kind of doing the humana, we don't have all the details, we don't know exactly where the planes full of Venezuelans that had been snatched up by Donald Trump's thugs and put on this plane and sent where? Not to Venezuela, but to El Salvador, with no court hearing, no due process, no evidentiary showing that these people were even sort of susceptible to being detained and deported. And the DOJ lawyers didn't have a lot of answers. Judge Boasberg was incredulous, and he said, here's what I'm ordering you to do. I want a sworn affidavit, so that sort of gets around the DOJ lawyers, yammering and stammering about, we don't really know what went on here. I want a sworn affidavit with a chronology. He didn't say minute by minute, but they would probably be well advised to make it a minute by minute chronology about when those planes took off, when they received notice of Judge Boasberg's order to turn the dang planes around, when those planes landed. And Judge Boasberg said, y'all are coming back into court, and we are going to drill down and see if the Trump administration intentionally violated my court order. And if he concludes that the Trump administration did intentionally and knowingly violate his court order, I think the next thing we're going to hear is the C word, contempt of court. But Judge Boasberg will decide what, if any, next steps should be taken, one, to address and remedy this situation, and two, to punish, to hold accountable the Trump administration in the event they did intentionally violate a federal judge's order.
On the latter half of what you just spoke about, what does contempt look like for the federal government? It's not like they have to spend any of their own money, for example. And so what really can judges do when you hold the federal government in contempt?
There's quite a bit they can do, Brian. There are two kinds of contempt: civil contempt and criminal contempt. Civil contempt is the lesser sanction or penalty, so let's start with that. Civil contempt is designed to put usually monetary fines or other conditions in place to urge the federal government to come into compliance with court orders, to basically what we call purge the contempt, get rid of the contempt by beginning to abide by existing court orders. That's civil contempt. However, if there are Trump administration officials, up to and including Donald Trump, who just intentionally defy and thumb their nose at and disobey court orders, then the judge can say, I am prepared to hold you in criminal contempt. Now, if you're going to hold somebody in criminal contempt, there has to be notice and an opportunity to be heard, basically a mini contempt trial. And here is the really good news, Brian. Ordinarily, judges cannot initiate prosecutions on their own. Why? Because prosecutions are exclusively an executive branch function and responsibility. It's the Department of Justice, under the control now, indeed under the thumb of Donald Trump, that gets to make the decision whether to prosecute a case or not. That generally includes contempt charges, except when the Department of Justice refuses to prosecute a contempt charge that is based on a violation of a judge's court order, then the judge has the opportunity to appoint an independent prosecutor and have that person prosecute the contempt charge against the federal official. So that is good news on the procedural front. Now, let me tell you, Brian, there's some great law review articles out there that collect up all of the instances of contempt by federal government agencies and officials. And what I will say is, in reading that law review article, rarely does push come to shove. Rarely do judges go all the way to criminal contempt hearings. For example, a cabinet official who just steadfastly refuses to comply with federal court orders. But importantly, the federal judges have the power and the authority to do it. And if ever that power and authority is going to be tested, it looks like it's in this lawless Trump administration.
Can I drop some cold water on this theory and ask, what about presidential pardon powers? I mean, doesn't Trump have carte blanche to basically issue pardons in the event that some administration official of his does get found to be in criminal contempt, that he could just issue a pardon and wipe the slate clean?
Well, I'm going to be honest here. Full disclosure, there is no precedent. In other words, no appellate court, up to and including the Supreme Court, has ever had to wrestle with that precise legal issue that you just spotted. You really have earned your law degree after nearly 500 episodes of the Legal Breakdown that you and I have been doing over the years. It's a great question. Let me give you my informed opinion on how a court would rule. You're absolutely right. Recently, the Supreme Court has reaffirmed just how broad and sweeping a president's pardon power is. However, just as the courts can never appoint a prosecutor except in the instance when their own authority, their own lawful constitutional authority, is being defied by the executive branch, I predict the Supreme Court will say it is a natural follow-on that if there is a criminal contempt conviction of a federal government official under those circumstances, guess what? The president's pardon power doesn't extend to that. Why? Because that is an offense against the judiciary that is necessary to uphold the judiciary's separate but equal powers as a co-equal branch of government, completely untested in the courts. But I actually think that result makes a lot of sense.
Glenn, as the result of this, John Roberts took the rare step of coming out and issuing a rebuke of Donald Trump because Trump logged on to Truth Social, surprise, surprise, demanding that Judge Boasberg actually be impeached for committing the cardinal sin of not allowing him to just he's disappearing people who haven't even been charged with a crime or much less convicted of a crime. And so what do you make of the fact that we actually now have Supreme Court justices on this far-right Supreme Court who are taking a stand against Trump's overreach?
Yeah, a really important statement. And let me say that chief justices of the Supreme Court almost never speak publicly about these kind of issues or disputes. Indeed, they usually do all of their speaking through their rulings. But here is what the chief justice said after, Elon Musk calls for impeachments of judges who displease, I guess, he and Donald Trump. And Donald Trump actually made some really intemperate remarks about Jeb Boasberg recently. Here is what the Chief Justice said. For more than 2 centuries, the Chief Justice said, it has been established that impeachment is not an appropriate response to disagreement concerning a judicial decision. The normal appellate review process exists for that purpose. If I can translate that from justice to English, that is basically John Roberts telling Donald Trump and Elon Musk, shut the hell up. And he's exactly right. These calls that we all know endanger judges when Donald Trump begins to call them names and Elon Musk insists that they must be impeached and removed because they issued some ruling that, displeased Musk and Trump. This is dangerous. We have seen judges like Tanya Chutkin in D.C. and Juan Merchan in New York be put in harm's way. Death threats come pouring in from Trump supporters. Their homes are swatted. In other words, false reports are made to the police that a violent crime happened inside their home, such that SWAT teams show up at judges' homes with guns drawn. I mean, this is the kind of nonsense and garbage and dangerous, inflammatory conduct that really has to stop. And in his, rather subtle way, the Chief Justice of the United States just told Donald Trump and Elon Musk, this has got to stop.
Glenn, you were actually quoted in an article in the Washington Post. I'll put that right here on this screen. This is about Judge Boasberg. You said that Judge Boasberg is a singularly remarkable prosecutor. I say that because he never lost a murder case and because he would never tell anybody he never lost a murder case. It wasn't in his DNA to talk about himself or his accomplishments. I don't think there's anybody better suited or better equipped to handle these challenges to the independence of the judiciary or challenges to American democracy. And so can you talk about these attacks on somebody? Look, it would be one thing if you had a judge who is as partisan as, let's say Judge Eileen Cannon down in Florida. But that's not the case with Judge Boasberg, who is deigning to defer not to Donald Trump, but to the law as it's written.
Yeah, Jeb Boasberg, in my experience, and I've known him for decades, not only did I supervise him when he was a homicide prosecutor in my homicide section at the D.C. U.S. Attorney's Office, he was my trial partner. We went to court every day, stood shoulder to shoulder, trying some really horrific murder cases. You want to take the measure of a man or a woman, have them as a trial partner in a, really high stakes murder case. This is a man who is singularly devoted to the rule of law, to the Constitution, and applies, the rules and the laws without fear or favor, fairly and equally, without any bias in favor or against one party or the other. I actually can sleep well at night knowing that we have somebody like Judge Boasberg litigating these most consequential issues, because regardless of how he rules, it's going to be right. It's going to be accurate in accordance with the law and the Constitution. And Brian, people may not remember, they may not have known in the first instance, Judge Boasberg was also the chief of the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court, when that whole thing blew up with the Carter Page FISA warrant that was issued, and it had some misinformation in it. Judge Boasberg took a look at what happened there. And after the Durham report came out, remember special counsel John Durham investigate the investigators? Yeah. Well, there was an FBI employee who I believe was a lawyer who was caught altering an email, and that altered information, bad information, false information, made its way into a FISA application. Judge Boasberg went after that so hard, he banned that person from ever having anything to do with any FISA court applications moving forward. And he also put safeguards in place demanding that the Department of Justice account for how it is these mistakes were made, making sure there were no other mistakes out there that went undiscovered and unaddressed. These were things that if people looked at them, they would say, wow, those seem to be pro-Trump rulings, pro-John Durham rulings. It didn't matter how those rulings played out, who they helped, who they hurt, who they held accountable, who they exonerated. He did the right thing under all circumstances, and that is what he will continue to do regardless of what Elon Musk or even Donald Trump says about him.
Well, look, this is especially important. I mean, really, this case is kind of what we've been expecting, so to speak, in the sense that we've waited to see what happens when the Trump administration inevitably decides to discard the ruling handed down from a judge, and that's what we're seeing right now. So hopefully we will see the Judge Boasberg here, take a hard line against this decision to completely ignore a lawful order. So a lot more to come on this topic in particular. For those who are watching right now, if you want to follow along and if you want to support us and independent media more broadly, the best way to do that is to subscribe to our channels. The links to both of them are right here on the screen. Glenn in particular is fast on his way to 1 million subscribers. So if you haven't yet subscribed, please hit the subscribe button. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.